The classroom went quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. A strict teacher slammed his textbook, eyes locked on the quietest boy in the room, the one no one believed in. "Solve this," he said, pointing to a math problem, designed to break anyone's spirit. Laughter buzzed in the air, but the boy stood up anyway. Heart racing, hands shaking, and one impossible decision to make: follow the rules, or change the game forever. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The clock above the blackboard ticked louder than usual that afternoon. In room 8, the air was thick with heat and boredom. A lazy fan creaked above, doing little to push away the sticky warmth of the Cebu sun. Students slouched in their chairs, half listening to their teacher's voice as it blended with the hum of tricycles and barking dogs outside. Then, without warning, a sharp sound cracked through the air. Bang! A thick math textbook slammed onto the teacher's desk. Everyone jumped. "Since you all think this is easy," Mr. Rosales said, his voice low and hard, "let's have someone prove it." He didn't wait for volunteers. His sharp eyes swept over the class and landed on the quietest figure in the room. "Neelan," he said, pointing one long finger, "come up here." The room fell dead silent. All eyes turned to the back row, where a thin boy sat motionless. Neelan barely lifted his head. His shoulders were hunched, and his school shirt was a little too big, the collar a little too worn. His shoes, once white, were now the color of dust and pavement. He looked like someone who preferred to disappear into the corner of the room, but he couldn't disappear now. "Come on," Mr. Rosales pressed. "You sit there like you understand everything. Let's see it." The blackboard behind the teacher showed a mess of numbers and letters, a puzzle of exponents, fractions, and tricky variables. It looked less like a math question and more like a dare. Nyland's heart began to pound, not softly but loud enough that he could feel it in his throat. His hands felt cold even though the room was warm. The eyes of his classmates were heavy on him, some curious, some amused. A few smirked, already predicting what would happen next. He was used to this. Being called out, being doubted. Slowly, he stood. He didn't say a word as he walked to the front. His steps were quiet but heavy. With each one, he felt like he was walking into a storm. Mr. Rosales watched him with folded arms and a half-smile that said he expected Neelan to fall flat on his face. It wasn't the first time. Last week, Mr. Rosales had barked at him for solving a question too slowly, even though he had gotten it right. Thinking isn't the same as knowing. The teacher had snapped and the class had laughed. Now here he was again. Nyland reached for the chalk. It was small, almost broken in half, and left white dust on his fingers. He stared at the board, at the twisted math problem that looked like a trap, and maybe that's what it was. Not a lesson, a trap. He took a breath. Behind him, someone whispered, "He's gonna mess it up." The voice came from Ricky, a boy who always joked loud enough for the class to hear but never raised his hand unless the answer was obvious. Neelan didn't turn around. His mind tried to focus, but it was hard. Every sound felt louder. The tapping, pencils, the creaking desks, the nervous coughs. He thought of his mother who had woken up at 4 a.m. that morning to wash clothes for neighbors. He thought of his little brother, who looked at him like he was a hero just for helping with homework. He couldn't fail, but the numbers didn't help. Not at first. They swirled around in his mind, tangled and stubborn. He tried to remember the formulas Mr. Rosales always drilled into them, step-by-step paths that were supposed to lead to the right answer. But those steps suddenly felt wrong. Useless. The chalk hovered over the board. Mr. Rosales let out a loud sigh. "Tick-tock," he said. A few giggles followed. Still, Neelan didn't move. Not because he didn't know anything, but because he was thinking. Deeply, carefully, he didn't want to repeat a formula. He wanted to understand the problem. He needed to see it from a new angle. And slowly, something in his brain shifted. He noticed a pattern, a small clue buried inside the chaos. A relationship between two terms no one had mentioned in class. His eyes widened slightly. He wasn't sure it would work, but he had to try. The usual path wasn't leading anywhere. Maybe he didn't have to follow it. The class grew quieter. Even Ricky stopped whispering. Nylan began to write, one symbol. Then another, not the way they'd been taught, not the steps from the textbook, but his own way, piecing together a path with quiet courage and stubborn logic. He didn't speak, he just wrote. And something about the way he moved, the way he paused between lines, made the class lean forward. For the first time, no one laughed. Not yet. Not this time. Mr. Rosales stared, frowning, and Nylan kept going. The chalk squeaked softly as Nylan continued to write, slow and steady. His fingers were covered in white dust now, his palms damp with sweat. But he didn't stop. His eyes were locked on the board, following invisible trails only he could see. Behind him, the classroom sat in silence. Even the fan above had decided to give up, letting the heat settle thick in the air. But no one seemed to notice anymore. All eyes were on the boy from the last seat, the one they had never expected to stand out. Mr. Rosales stood with his arms crossed, tapping his foot against the floor. He squinted at the board, his brow furrowed, trying to understand what Nylan was doing. This wasn't how he'd taught them to solve equations. Nylan, he said finally, his voice sharp. You're wasting time. That's not the correct process. Nylan paused, chalk still in hand. The teacher's words echoed in his mind like a warning. For a second, doubt crept in. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe the strange method forming on the board was just a mess, not a breakthrough. But then he remembered. He remembered nights at home sitting at the kitchen table under a flickering bulb. While the rest of the world slept, Nylan would work through puzzles from old textbooks he had found in a second-hand shop. No one had taught him those tricks. He had just figured them out, because numbers, in a strange way, made more sense than people ever did. He also remembered the beat-up radio in their tiny apartment, always playing music while his mother cooked, and how he noticed rhythms in the songs that matched the steps of math problems, patterns, repeats, layers. It was like the numbers were singing to him. Quietly, just beneath the surface, he gripped the chalk tighter. I think this works, he said quietly. His voice was small but steady. A murmur ran through the class. No one expected him to talk back. Not to Mr. Rosales. But he wasn't talking back to be rude. He just believed in what he was doing. A girl near the front, Lena, who usually kept to herself, leaned forward in her seat. She had always noticed Nylan, though she'd never said much. She watched now with quiet curiosity, her eyes flicking between him and the board. Nylan took another breath and began again. He erased a wrong step, adjusted a number, and kept building the solution from the bottom up, like he was constructing something personal, something his own. The board slowly filled with a new path, not the standard one, not the steps in the workbook, but something different. Something that actually started to make sense. He's guessing, a voice whispered from the back. It was Thomas, the class clown, but even he didn't sound sure anymore. Nylan didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. His focus was total now. He was chasing the answer like a thread through a maze, following every twist and turn, trusting the rhythm in his mind. Mr. Rosales stepped closer, his frown deepening. This is untested, he said sharply. You're not following the correct structure. Nylan turned just slightly. But the structure wasn't working, he said, his voice barely louder than a breath. I had to find another way. The room went quiet again. Lena blinked. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Thomas shifted in his seat. A few students who had been ready to laugh were now staring with wide eyes. Because the strange thing was, it looked like it was working. Nylan reached the last part of the problem, the most tangled, the kind of thing that usually took a full page to sort out. But with his method, his mix of logic, pattern, and gut feeling, he was already untying it step by step. He paused, sweat dripping down his temple. His heart was thumping again, but now for a different reason. Not fear. Hope. He could feel it. He wasn't just solving the question. He was doing something bigger. Something that mattered more than just getting it right. He was showing that the way people like him saw the world, quietly, creatively, deserved to be seen. The final answer was coming together. He circled the last step. There it was. Done. The classroom didn't clap. Not yet. No one moved. It was like they were holding their breath. Then Lena spoke. Just 2 words. He did it. That was all it took. Whispers broke out across the room. Not mocking. Not cruel. Curious. Amazed. Thomas leaned over to his desk partner. Wait, is that actually right? Even Mr. Rosalis was silent. He stared at the board, his lips tight. He didn't speak. Not yet. Nealon stepped back from the chalkboard, chalk still in his hand, and looked around the room. This time, no one was laughing. And that, for the first time, felt like a win. For a full 10 seconds, the classroom stayed frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time had paused with the final chalk mark on the board. Then slowly, voices rose. Not loud, but curious. Wait, that actually worked? How did he even figure that out? Even Thomas, who had spent most of the year cracking jokes, leaned forward with narrowed eyes, studying Nyland's work like it was written in another language. In some ways it was not the language of math drills and textbook steps, but the language of insight, the kind that came from trial, error, and quiet thinking. The kind you learned when no one was watching. Mr. Rosalis stepped toward the board. His eyes scanned each line of Nyland's solution. His expression didn't change, but something behind his sharp look had softened. Just a little. This is not the method we use, he said at last. His voice was flat, but his eyes remained on the board. But it does appear to solve the problem. Another pause. He didn't say good job. He didn't smile, but he didn't erase the board either. To Nyland, that silence was everything. It meant he hadn't failed. It meant, maybe, he was right. Behind him, chairs squeaked as students whispered to each other. A few glanced at Nyland with new eyes. The boy who never spoke. The boy who kept to himself sitting in the last row. Now that same boy had just changed the entire mood of the room. Lena was smiling openly now, her eyes shining with something close to pride. She raised her hand. Sir, she asked, can he explain how he did it? Mr. Rosalis blinked. He wasn't used to students asking that kind of question. You want him to explain? He asked. Lena nodded. Yes. I couldn't follow it, but I want to. All eyes returned to Nyland. He froze for a moment. Talking was harder than solving. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. But something about Lena's question made him feel steadier. He turned back to the board and faced the class. I started by looking for a shortcut, he said softly. But not the kind we're taught. His voice was quiet, but the room was quieter. I noticed these numbers. He pointed. They had a pattern. The fractions here could be flipped if you rearrange this part. And then this, it's kind of like a mirror image. If you break the problem into smaller pieces, it's easier to solve. He paused, searching for the right words. I didn't guess, he added. I just saw something that made sense to me. Even Thomas raised an eyebrow, muttering, Dang, that's wild. Nyland stepped back again, unsure what else to say, and then the unexpected happened. Lena clapped. Just once. At first, then again, others followed slowly, then faster. Not because a teacher told them to, but because they had just seen something they didn't expect. Nealon, the quiet kid from the back row, had made something difficult look almost beautiful. Mr. Rosales cleared his throat. He was still watching the board, arms folded again, but this time his face had changed. Less harsh, more thoughtful. You've taken a different path, he said finally. Not wrong, just different. He looked at Neelan directly. We don't always encourage that in class. Maybe we should. It was the closest thing to praise the man had ever given anyone. The room relaxed. Students sat back, buzzing with quiet conversations. Neelan walked slowly, back to his seat. His legs felt a little shaky, but his chest felt lighter. Lena smiled at him as he passed. He managed a small smile back. He sat down at his desk, still gripping the chalk like a trophy. Thomas leaned over from the next row. Hey man, he said, that was kinda cool. Where'd you learn that stuff? Neelan shrugged, unsure how to explain. Just figured it out, I guess. You should help me next time, Thomas said with a grin. Seriously? Neelan didn't know what to say. No one had ever asked him that before. Across the room, Mr. Rosales began cleaning the board. He hesitated, then paused before wiping off Neelan's work. He reached into his drawer and pulled out his phone. He snapped a photo of the board, then, without saying a word, began erasing it. The moment was over, but something had changed. Later, that day, the school principal came into the classroom holding a flyer. She called out, Is Neelan here? Neelan blinked and raised his hand slowly. The principal smiled. We've just received an invitation to a regional math workshop next month. I think you might be interested. The class gasped. A few students whispered excitedly. Neelan sat stunned. Him? Talk to me after class, the principal added, then stepped back outside. As the door closed behind her, Neelan stared at his desk. He felt like his heart might fly out of his chest. Lena leaned toward him. See, she whispered. I told you it mattered. And for the first time in his life, Neelan believed it too. The days after Neelan's moment at the board passed like scenes from a dream. Something had shifted, not just in the classroom but in the way people looked at him. It wasn't the wide eyes that surprised him the most, or the curious questions from classmates who used to ignore him. It was the respect. Quiet at first, like a breeze before the rain, but slowly it grew stronger. Even Thomas, who had once laughed at everything and everyone, now dropped by Neelan's desk with math questions instead of jokes. How'd you know to do that? He'd ask. Can you help me try it your way? Neelan always nodded. He didn't say much, but he listened. And little by little, his seat at the back of the class no longer felt like a shadow. It felt like a starting line. Mr. Rosales, too, had changed. He still carried the same worn briefcase and kept the same stern look most of the time, but his voice had softened. During lessons, he started asking more questions, not just for answers, but for ideas. Does anyone have a different way to solve this? He'd ask. The class was stunned the first time, but Neelan raised his hand, and so did others. One afternoon, after most of the class had left, Mr. Rosales pulled Neelan aside. The hallway was quiet, just the distant sound of basketballs bouncing. In the gym. I was wrong about you, the teacher said simply. And maybe about how I teach. He paused, then added, You reminded me that understanding is more important than memorizing. Neelan didn't know what to say, but he smiled, and that was enough. At home, the change was felt even more deeply. When Neelan told his mother about the regional math workshop, she sat down at the small kitchen table and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, not from sadness, but from something heavier. Pride. I always knew, she whispered. Anak, I always knew you had something special. That night he stayed up late, but not just to study. He brought out his old keyboard, the one his mother had saved up. For by working extra cleaning jobs, his fingers moved gently over the keys, playing a tune that had lived in his head since the day of the challenge. Each note felt like a memory. The tension, the silence, the sound of chalk against the board. But also, the applause. The quiet moment when he realized he was no longer invisible. It was the sound of becoming. A week later, during lunch break, Neelan asked Mr. Rosales if he could speak to the class. The teacher raised an eyebrow. "Of course," he said, surprised. Neelan stood at the front of room 8, just like he had during the challenge. But this time the board behind him was clean and his hands weren't shaking. "I've been thinking," he began. "A lot of people in this class are smart, but not everyone feels brave enough to speak up." There were some nods, a few curious glances. "So I want to start something small," he continued. "Just once a week. We can meet after class. Help each other with math in different ways, no pressure, just ideas." Silence. Then Lena raised her hand. "I'll join." Tomas lifted a hand, pretending to stretch. "Me too, obviously," he said, grinning. Soon more hands followed, even quiet kids who rarely spoke up. It wasn't a club. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Mr. Rosales watched from his desk, a small smile on his face. By the end of the month, the classroom had changed. The last seat was no longer where Neelan sat alone. It was where students gathered after class, where laughter mixed with quiet determination, where new methods were tested, and different ideas were shared. The chalkboard no longer carried just equations, but questions like, what if we tried it another way? Can someone explain that differently? It became a room full of voices that once stayed silent, and at the center of it was Neelan. Not loud, not flashy, but steady, like a quiet engine behind something important. The day he left for the regional workshop, the whole class surprised him with a handmade card. Inside were scribbled notes. "Thanks for helping me understand fractions. You're a genius, but like, the cool kind. Teach us when you get back." Even Mr. Rosales wrote something at the bottom. "Keep thinking differently. The dumb world needs it." As Neelan boarded the bus, backpack slung over one shoulder, keyboard case strapped across his back, he looked out at the school building growing smaller behind him. His heart was full, not just with excitement for what came next, but with something deeper. He had started the year in the last seat. Now he was leading others forward, not because he followed the rules, but because he dared to write his own. And somewhere inside, he knew this was only the beginning. Because sometimes, where the numbers lead, is exactly where you're meant to be.